Hello. I want to go over some very troubling developments over in the Ukrainian war. Most notably, this missile package the United States has set up to send over to Ukraine. Now, I think a lot of people, they understand that it's missiles. They probably aware that it includes the multiple launch rocket systems. That's been in the news a lot, but it also contains these medium long range missiles. Now these are capable of hitting deep within Russia. This is the kind of threat that Russia takes very seriously. This is why they're in Ukraine to begin with. They feel very threatened. Ukraine wanted to become part of NATO, a country right on its border, in its backyard. And what does NATO bring along with it? Missile systems, anti-aircraft systems, possibly nuclear weapons. Okay? So, looking at this from the Russian perspective, the fact that Ukraine was going to go into NATO, and it eventually would have probably brought in missile systems. Even though everyone said that wouldn't happen and all these things, but it always happens. Now, looking at this for the Russians, that's already happening right now. Ukraine's not even in NATO. Ukraine is collapsing, but yet the United States is going to bring in medium to long range missiles. Now, I can tell you this is not going to go over very well. We can probably expect a very, very harsh strike back by Russia on this. This will not be tolerated. Had warned about this in the red line that was being crossed. And they're not talking about the MLRS, because those are already in use on both sides in Ukraine. They're talking about these longer range missiles. And just the fact that this entire war was about, to Russia, it was about preventing exactly what's happening now from happening. So this goes to the most fundamental level of what they're fighting for. So you have to keep that in mind. Now, another important point is that to Russia, they are already at war with NATO. NATO didn't declare war against Russia, but all their actions signify that they are at war with Russia. They're sharing their intelligence, satellite, communications technology. They're sending over billions of dollars of weapons. It's actually up to $100 billion total between all the supporting countries of Ukraine. And the United States at the forefront, which is up to over like 60 billion, including all their latest packages. It's almost on a daily basis. You have to check to see how much it's increased. Now keep in mind what the United States has already invested in just a couple months was what the United States had invested in over 20 years in the war in Afghanistan. So you can see, to Russia, they're fighting the full force of NATO now, including mercenaries and all kinds of other, training, and there's supposedly command and control being done by NATO and the United States. The Ukrainian generals are in constant communication with the Pentagon, for example. So they're already fighting NATO in their eyes. Now, those two factors, I think, are not being grasped by a lot of people who are in the West or who are in the media in the West or propagandists. The fact, and just reiterating them too, that Russia feels very threatened, and at its essence, it's trying to protect itself from things like these long-range missiles. So this is really the crux of this entire war. And number two is that they already feel they're being attacked, and that they're already fighting the full force in NATO. So when Putin responded saying that he's going to strike at targets that haven't been hit yet, that could be a very ominous statement. It may be something that the West really hasn't fully grasped the meaning of. And I'll tell you what I think he means. I think he means one of two things. He may start going after more of like political targets in Ukraine, like in Kiev, like going after the like the Congress, where their deputies meet, or the presidential buildings, things like this. They might go after, like, they might know where Zelensky stays, might try to hammer that with missile attacks. That's one meaning, because they kind of been avoiding that. All right. Now, number two could be that they are going to start going outside of Ukraine, hitting like staging areas, transportation hubs. Keep in mind, the main priority of Russia is going to stop the transport of these weapons that it feels most threatened by, longer range missiles. So they're going to do everything in their power. I mean, they're already in a whole war against Ukraine to stop that very thing. So by the West not heeding the Russian warnings of this red line, are there not any consequences to that? Is this just going to be just rhetoric coming from the Russians? I don't think so. Especially not from Putin. Usually when he says something, it usually has some teeth. Now, keep in mind that most tactics that the West has used have failed miserably. The sanctions are just a complete and utter disaster. In fact, it's become kind of a mockery. And these countries that didn't join along are like looking at this and going, wow, well, that would have been a huge mistake. I mean, Europe is just a basket case right now, and they're only going to get much, much worse, especially like UK. It's on track for some of the worst inflation and outrageous energy bills and a lot of problems. Looks like Boris Johnson might lose his position. They're doing a no confidence vote. I think that's coming today or tomorrow. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets removed. He's done an incredibly terrible job. And it shows you how wrong the West has been and all these actions it has taken against Russia and in Ukraine. And this is the blowback. It's already starting to come through. And you're seeing it on Boris Johnson. Now, it looks like the Germans already felt a lot of this blowback, and they've really started to reconsider, a lot of their previous actions. They actually refused to meet with the Ukrainian foreign minister, which is actually pretty big news to me. A lot of other countries, too, are opting out of the sanctions. Serbia has always been Turkey is also even starting to make some statements that are rather a little shocking, claiming that basically that the West is destroying itself. I came out of Erdogan, and I had mentioned before that I feel that Erdogan is being really crafty here, and I think he is actually working with the Russians and working with NATO. He does this a lot. If you look at like the Middle East, he played both sides a lot. He's quite the fox. So, the whole thing with blocking Finland and Sweden was a brilliant move by Erdogan, because if that would have occurred, and they were trying to fast track them in, if they brought in, especially Finland, that would have escalated the war dramatically. So Erdogan pulled his trump card out and stopped that. Now they still might try to override Turkey somehow on this, but I think at the moment it looks like that's a victory for Russia. The sanctions were a huge victory for Russia, considering the ruble has gone up I believe like a couple 100%. The amount of money that Russia is making off their energy and their wheat crops is the most they've ever made. They actually had record on both of those. So the sanctions have completely backfired. It's only driven up the energy prices. It's driven up the ruble strength, and it's causing famine in a lot of the parts of the world. And I think a lot of these places in the world are realizing that the famine started with the sanctions that the West levied against Russia, because there's a lot of obstacles they put in there from these countries from allowing to get Russian wheat and other commodities. And that is that they removed the SWIFT system from the Russians, so they can't commerce their products so easily. And they also have done a lot of things to inhibit Russian shipping, and they also strong-armed a lot of these smaller countries from participating in trade with Russia. So despite all these obstacles, the Russians managed to have a record year for both their, all the commodities, the wheat and their energy. That's actually very surprising. I don't think anyone would have predicted that. So this is just a huge slap in the face to the West. And I mentioned this in one of my earliest videos, that there was no consideration of any consequence when they imposed these draconian sanctions. Biden just got up there, announced to everyone all these, they had them prefabbed, all ready to go. He just went out there, he announced that they're going to do these. Everyone thought he'd be a rock star, that he would have Russian, politicians and Putin crawling on their knees, begging for mercy. That's what they all thought. But actually, it's the complete opposite. The American people are paying the price. They're very angry. You're seeing fuel shortages in the United States, food shortages everywhere. And this is all coming back on Biden and the EU. It's because they didn't think about the consequences. And the consequences are really obvious. It's not like, you had to have a whole, building full of, these PhDs to figure that there was going to be huge blowback from this. I think a lot of these countries realize that, like, China and India, because China has often gone along with the United States on a lot of things. Not all, but it wouldn't have been unheard of for them to have joined in. Odds were against it, but India kind of surprised a lot of people. But I think they were wise. They saw the consequences. So everything that the West has done basically has backfired. All their weapons, supplies that they sent over to Ukraine get blown up in warehouses. All the howitzers that the Americans sent over. I've seen 2 sets of those already destroyed, and a third one is reportedly already. Just haven't seen confirmation photos. I believe there's 4 altogether. Italian howitzers already destroyed. It's not working out at all. It's because they didn't consider any of the consequences to shipping all these arms over. The consequences, you're not going to get those to the front lines. Because the Russians have all the road systems, the rail systems under observation. They have eyes on the ground. They have UAVs and satellites watching everything. You're not going to sneak things by very easily. So it's actually astounding just how much of a defeat this Ukrainian war has been for the West. I mean, it's already collapsing. And, we're probably looking at, and I did a video on this already in more detail about how Ukraine's going to collapse, and it's going to be like an economic collapse, political collapse. It's going to be like, most likely like a revolution, a rebellion eventually. And that's just going to be like the icing on the cake for the Russians. Because in that situation, all these dangerously escalatory things that the West tried to do in Ukraine completely backfired with blowback. The failure of the sanctions, the failure of all their arms and arms shipments, the failure of their command and control. Keep in mind that the Allies are, the West is controlling the Ukrainians' defeat. I mean, at the end, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing, like these American generals just caused the demise of the complete Ukrainian army. This was hailed as like the greatest army in Europe before this, that they were totally prepared to take on Russia. Remember all that talk? So there's going to be all this finger pointing at the end. And it's going to be all pointing to, NATO commanders and the Pentagon generals, because they're literally in contact, like all the time, controlling everything on the front lines. So the failure is on every level. Military, political. They installed all of these puppet presidents. I mean, this is Biden's baby. They invited, Zelensky on the big screen into Congress, and they all clapped like baby seals. I mean, they're all going to go down with this Zelensky Titanic. Well, it's a Zelensky and Biden Titanic. And the most astounding thing is that these fools thought that they were going to be rock stars. They really did. They thought this was such an easy thing that they were going to pull off. And, to astute people who are watching this, they're like, these people are so dim-witted. Like, how can you not realize the consequences? Or, like, how can you not realize that the way Ukraine is logistically, with all these Russian-speaking people and ethnic Russians everywhere, how can they possibly not know where all these arms are going and what's in all these rail cars? And, they know where everything is in the warehouse. Someone with Russian ties, which is like half the people, basically say, yeah, this warehouse, they just loaded up with 1,000 rockets. They just today. And then next thing you know, a caliper missile hits it. I mean, that's how it is, all over Ukraine. It's not even just in eastern Ukraine. I mean, there's Russian ethnically tied to, all through Ukraine. Not as much as on eastern, but there are. So it's almost an impossibility to expect to have been able to bring all these arms in. I mean, how could you be so dim-witted to think? I'm just a guy with a small YouTube channel who likes reading the news, foreign news, American. I don't speak Russian. Then I could figure that out. Like, it was so obvious. How are you going to bring these weapons in? You can't. It was destined to fail. This whole thing, the whole idea of Europe, which is like, 50% dependent on energy from Russia, that somehow you're going to try to do some kind of an embargo. This is like insanity. And, anyone who's not totally demented should be able to see. Somebody in the White House should have said, hey, wake up. This ain't going to work. But they are so drunk on hopium. And they were dancing around in glee, thinking that they finally pulled off some kind of an amazing victory that's going to pull them out of this horrendous situation they are in the United States with these Poles in the gutter, destroyed economy, rampant homelessness, drug problems, open border. It goes on and on. I mean, the amount of destruction they've already done in the United States, they somehow think that they're going to pull off this, Hail Mary 90-yard pass and come back, to cheering crowds. Of course not. This is like a fantasy. These people are not living in reality. And so basically what I'm getting at is this is Biden's baby, Zelensky's baby, and they both are failing. They're on their Titanic, and it's going to sink. Thanks for listening.